These exercises, which were in the main derived from Rosicrucian sources, were to be practiced only under the guidance of his spiritual advisor at central headquarters. At the completion of each 2-week exercise, Fox would report to this advisor and be given further instructions. The advisor kept a scholastic summary file for each student that was akin to a university transcript. These formalities were all part of Blyton's ultimately unsuccessful effort to constitute his movement as a fully accredited degree-granting seminary. The story of Mitchell Jacover provides such a third example of refinements in the order's student training during 1972. Jacover was born in Skokie, Illinois, and reared in an upper-middle-class kosher household that followed the Jewish calendar and celebrated a traditional Sabbath meal every Friday evening. At the age of 17, Jacover began to explore a series of alternative spiritual groups in the Chicago area, including the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, the Divine Light Mission, and the First Church of Psychic Metaphysics. After high school, he studied photography at a fine arts college in Chicago and worked for the Chicago Sun-Times and the Tribune. He discovered the order when a close friend's brother, who was a star athlete, dropped out of high school and joined the movement. Jacover attended a few classes and found that the rather odd organization had a compelling quality about it. It made certain things real about a spiritual life. I'd have to literally drop the job, drop everything, and put myself in a position where I was paying 100% attention to initiatory attainment. Jacover's friend joined his brother in the movement within a few months, but it took Jacover almost a year to let go of a promising career, a close woman friend, and his dog. In the meantime, he continued attending classes and meeting other people who were affiliated with the group. During this period, he experienced a mystical conversion to Christ after reading the New Testament from cover to cover one day. I had never looked at Jesus as someone in the teacher line with mastery over things. That evening, my body was on fire. I didn't feel sick, just a little delirious from the heat. After a long night during which Bible passages kept flashing through his mind, Jacover awoke feeling like he had been seared by the Spirit of Christ. Soon after this experience in January 1972, the young photographer sold all his possessions, drove to the Chicago Brother House, and asked to join. His first 3 days as a novice were spent in the center's chapel on a cleansing fast of raw vegetables. He was asked to meditate on the course of his life up to the moment of his entry into the order. The only person he saw during this period was a priest who occasionally checked in on him. As he later recalled, it wasn't like you felt you were being hypnotized. It felt like the appropriate thing to do, spending some time alone examining your life. The young novice's strongest recollection of this time of seclusion was the spiritually vibrant atmosphere of the chapel itself. What was very clear was that the presence that was in the area around the altar was something to be respected, not for the symbols themselves, but for a certain otherworldly presence that I certainly felt was there. When the period of seclusion was over, Jacover entered into the common life of the Brotherhood, which was similar in pattern to that of the Lincoln Mission Station. The main differences were the greater scale of street patrol work. 15 two-man teams were sent out twice a week to such unsavory neighborhoods as Old Town and Armitage Avenue, and the intensive remodeling activity in which the household was engaged. This effort was made necessary after the order acquired an apartment building at Oakley Avenue and decided to alter its interior so that over 75 people could be accommodated in what had once been 4 family units. During this period, Jacover recalled, the Brother House had the air of a military boot camp, with novice masters acting the part of drill sergeants. The overall striving of the students was to emulate the spiritual mastery of Christ. This involved learning to use the word and the law so that one could exercise the same dominion over material conditions as that demonstrated by the Master Jesus. Jacover would go on to become a minister in the order and the executive director of a woman's shelter in Portland, Oregon. If these stories illustrate a first level of institutional refinement through education, there was more. A second level was articulated in the Book of Order. This volume, which was distributed to all centers in May of 1972, contained the rules, directives, definitions, and procedures necessary for the orderly function of the group's daily life. Although much of what was contained in the book was not new, it was the first time all such elements had been collected in one volume. The regulation re-emphasized that the movement's keynote was service to man. The form of this service was fourfold: administering the sacraments as they were given by the Master Jesus, teaching the use of mankind's spiritual tools, providing for those in need of food, shelter, or clothing without charge, and healing through the power of the Spirit. The regulation also gave precise directions for chapel and altar preparation, which included seating, incensing, the placement of the law candles, the construction of covers for chalices and patens, and the proper technique of cleaning altar implements. The section on garb added several refinements from earlier practice. The suit a brother wore in public was now to be dark blue rather than black. Women novices were to dress in dark blue jumpers, which would be replaced by black dresses when they took first vows. House robes differed according to one's vowed status. Life-vowed members wore a blue-gray robe, priests a wine-red robe, and master teachers a white robe. Members were not to consider the progressive changes in garb as a symbol of rank, but rather as a symbol of degrees of spiritual attainment. They were to help others to discern at a glance a member's true attainment, and to help the student feel an actual difference after taking new vows. With the rapid increase in the Brotherhood's membership, it was decided to set up a tailoring department to sew uniforms according to standard patterns. The Book of Order was refined and supplemented throughout 1972 in an attempt to dramatize the gravity of life vows and perhaps lessen the frequency of defections. A more formalized ceremony was instituted in San Francisco. After distributing all worldly goods to the poor, candidates went on a complete fast and spent the eve of the vow-taking in solitary retrospection of their past life. The following morning they knelt in prayer for 3 hours before the altar in the chapel. A priest then heard their confessions, which cleared the way for the sealing of the vows. The vow ceremony itself took place before the assembled brotherhood inside the chapel sanctuary. The initiates were informed of the finality of their decision and given a last opportunity to withdraw. They were also reminded that the order was an instrument vowed to fulfilling upon the earth the divine edict to prepare the earth and its peoples in the last days for the new age. By having the vows of service, obedience, humility, purity, and poverty implanted upon their souls, the candidates understood that they were henceforth under the direct authority of the Esoteric Council and permitted to enter into the full study of the mysteries. The vows were proclaimed to be binding upon the members for the duration of their lifetimes and not to be lifted. The ceremony ended when each candidate was presented with a yellow rose, a new cross, and a gray-blue robe. Another refinement during this period followed from a revelation that directed all who were baptized to begin wearing a brass medallion molded in the shape of the order's insignia. As will be recalled, this insignia was a cross set within a triangle, both of which were inscribed within a squared circle. The medallion was held to act as a kind of amulet that would protect members from negative psychic influences. When worn around the neck, only Christ's elite, the White Brothers, would be able to communicate with members from the spiritual realm. A directive from Blyton dated August 28th established a set pattern for Saturdays and Sundays in the order. Saturdays would begin with communion and a morning class, after which the day was to be devoted entirely to recreational activities. If a member had to work at an outside job on Saturday, he or she was to take another day off during the week. The directive also declared Sunday a holy day that was to be dedicated to prayer, meditation, and the enjoyment of nature. food preparation, schoolwork, movies, and other festivities were all proscribed on this day. Previous to this time, weekends had occasionally been used for intensive remodeling and house chores, especially when a new property had been bought. Several early members speculated that the rigorous weekly cycle of prayer, classes, and physical labor may have been a factor behind the movement's 50% attrition rate. It is likely that Blyton's directive was, at least in part, a response to this problem. The newly instituted Saturday morning class was to be based upon passages from the Book of Activity. This slender volume, which was a compilation of revelatory aphorisms given for the order's edification, articulated the fundamental elements of Blyton's millenarian, restorationist, and initiatory vision. By the time the book became the focus of Saturday morning classes, it had acquired the status of sacred scripture within the movement. As a former brother recalled, in those days it was not questioned whatsoever that it was from Jesus Christ. We used to half-seriously talk about the day when it would be incorporated into the Bible as part of the Book of Acts, a message received by Blyton on February 1972, directing that the things of the Book of Activity should be made up and added to the New Testament confirms this recollection. The prologos to the book proclaimed its scriptural status in unmistakable terms. For as his apostles did write the Gospels, thy way to light thy footsteps, so does the book of Activity light the way for those to come in the future, and serves as a guide to thy mission in earth. Likewise shalt thou now write those things which shall open the doors of man for the future, not denying the New Testament, but working new and proper ways that man might fulfill the glory of the Father in this new age. There are one or two exceptions shall be, for as the old law was set according to man's needs, the new law as a guide shall be set for both man and woman's needs. The book's title was derived from the second chapter, in which the law of activity was proclaimed as the new law for the coming age. This new law declared that spiritual and physical service to those in need would henceforth be the activity through which God's Spirit would manifest in the lives of illumined disciples. The third level of consolidation and refinement during 1972 occurred during the elaboration of internal organizational structures and roles for the different ranks of members. This elaboration was made necessary by the movement's continuing expansion in both membership and geographical reach. By the time of the 1972 annual meeting, the total number of vowed members in good standing had topped 500, and there were 56 order stations spread throughout every state of the Union except Alaska. Priestly ordinations had risen from 21 in 1971 to 48 in 1972, making it possible to turn many mission stations into first-year schools administered by a priest. The student population of these schools ranged from 10 in Albuquerque and 17 in New Haven to over 40 at the newly purchased Brotherhood at 101 Steiner Street in San Francisco. Easter and Christmas celebrations in major centers such as Chicago were now attracting more than 100 non-vowed participants. With centers spread over such a wide geographical area, coordination of action became a major challenge. Blyton's directives during this period, therefore, emphasized two related themes: the student's obedience to priestly authority and the priest's obedience to the Director General. As the new Book of Order declared, one thing is always necessary: direct obedience to the teacher. It was through obedience to the priesthood, the director asserted, that the student learned obedience to the self within. Priests were spiritual guides who had taken eternal vows to serve as mediators between God and the student until the student had reached spiritual maturity. In a letter sent out in February 1972, members were informed that if they had been disobedient to their priest and had not repented by Easter, they would be sent out on 90 days' leave. A reluctance to obey the orders of women priests was particularly condemned, an indication that some brothers were less than happy about submitting to the authority of women. The letter admonished students to remember that most priests had only recently been ordained. Though imperfect, they must be cooperated with and not opposed. At the same time, Blyton warned priests not to lord their authority over students or to treat them like slaves. The students were their brothers and sisters and would be shown brotherly respect and consideration at all times, not just when the priest wanted something done. Although they were technically free from many of the restrictions placed upon students, priests must set an example of Christ-like service by observing house rules. They were not to form a privileged elite within the order, and were to work at outside jobs like the brothers when stationed in small missions. Priests were also expected to render unwavering obedience to the Director General. In compliance with a revealed command he had received during the summer of 1972, Blyton announced he would no longer tolerate disobedience from those in the priesthood. Failure to follow the form of the order and to properly care for the welfare of the students would be severely dealt with. Priestly responsibilities were further clarified and elaborated at special priest conferences held in San Francisco and Chicago in late June and July. This emphasis on obedience to hierarchical authority resonated strongly with the Jesuit pattern Blyton so admired. The Director General had come to believe, as Ignatius Loyola before him, that obedience was an absolute necessity if an order were to retain its discipline and coherence. Obedience was also seen as a safeguard against pride and self-will. It stimulated the heroic virtues in students and emboldened them to undertake actions from which they would otherwise shrink. The irony of this authoritarian position was that in time it would ingrain in order members just like the opposite attitudes, those of passivity and timidity, especially with regard to risk-taking or experimentation of any kind. In the long run, this weakening of nerve would greatly lessen the members' effectiveness as missionaries of a bold, vibrant, and self-empowering brand of Christianity. As part of his attempt to strengthen and develop hierarchical authority in the movement, Blyton began to delegate some of his temporal power to carefully chosen lieutenants. Herbert Woodhead, a 55-year-old retired Air Force officer, was put in charge of all procurement matters. Robert Reynolds was appointed to coordinate housing purchases and repairs for the newly formed real estate department, and Barbara France was given authority over all bookkeeping and financial transactions. Each of these officials worked within hailing distance of Blyton at 20 Steiner Street. The Christian Community Bureau was made an independent organization and put under the direction of David Hamilton, a former disc jockey. Hamilton coordinated the burgeoning lay movement from the Order Center in Wichita. The Lay Order of Discipleship was placed under the leadership of Bernadette Gay and moved to its new headquarters in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The delegation of Blyton's spiritual authority also began to take firmer shape in 1972. In obedience to a message he received in May, Blyton called his apostles to San Francisco in June for an intensive week of planning meetings. The apostles, it was decided, would now constitute Blyton's privy council, an inner circle who would receive his highest level of initiatory and alchemical training. It was also made clear that each apostle would create in his or her own region a semi-autonomous school of initiation modeled on the San Francisco Center. In this way, Blyton hoped to plant stable institutional forms around the country that would be able to continue the work's work after his death. The June gatherings also produced a greatly elaborated ritual manual and some provisional plans concerning the movement's future development. It was agreed that Privy Council meetings would take place biannually, and that during these meetings the master teachers would help Blyton with the increased rate of ordinations that were being performed in San Francisco. In addition, the seminaries in Chicago and Boston would begin training and ordaining their own regional candidates for the priesthood. The larger objective behind these increased ordinations was to create a national network of masters, bishops, and priests who had been authentically initiated into the ancient Christian mysteries. The religious authority of this alternative to mainline denominations, hierarchy would be based on its initiatory power and not on the routinized charisma of its offices. In the wake of the June meetings, Blyton began to turn over some of his teaching and counseling functions to the master teachers. During the priest conferences that summer, for instance, it was the teachers who gave the major addresses, led the workshops, and counseled the priests. Within a short time, a mythology and mystique had developed around these figures. It was commonly believed, for instance, that they were reincarnated white brothers who had served many lifetimes and attained a high degree of spiritual realization. Several of this elite circle had reportedly been close personal disciples of Jesus in Palestine and were returning to carry forward the evolutionary work of that period. Like the gurus of South Asian spirituality, these adepts were credited with having a discernible darshan, or charismatic presence, and acute spiritual sight. This faculty allowed them to perceive the subtle forces in the human body and to read the minds of students. As generals in Blyton's army of initiates, the teachers had been empowered to draw light into a person's body for illumination, and to rend the veil around the self so that a student could see the inner being. Their own initiations, according to one former teacher, who is now an Orthodox priest, were not just a theoretical sort of thing. Rather, they were actual experiences of a paranormal nature during which the initiates entered a higher dimension and sat in the councils of the White Brotherhood. When the master teachers entered a room in their flowing white robes and golden cords, members would stand to acknowledge that Christ had come. Blyton claimed that he had not personally chosen these teachers. Rather, the Master Jesus, in revelatory messages, had indicated which priests were to be his elite co-workers. But the first three students ordained into mastery, Matthew Lipa, Timothy Wayne Harris, and Raoul Eric Fuchs, had already left the movement by 1972. The reasons for Lipa's departure were related earlier. Harris, who had become the Brotherhood's Director of Spiritual Education in 1971, left because of marital difficulties and disagreements over the speed with which Blyton was ordaining young priests. As he recalled, when you go back into the late 60s, a lot of people that came in were between 18 and 25. Ordaining people that young and having them run centers, counsel people, take care of marital problems, this was kind of risky. I think it would have worked better if we had allowed people to get more experience before giving them so much responsibility. Fuchs, who had been only 19 at the time of his ordination, was unable to live according to the order's rigid disciplines and left in 1971. He subsequently became part of the San Francisco gay community and struggled with alcoholism. These defections left 7 remaining apostles to whom Blyton would begin to delegate his spiritual authority after the June 1972 meetings. They were an ambitious, strong-willed, and talented group of individuals. The 4th person ordained into mastery was Marthelia McCaffrey, Jenny Wilday, an Illinois native who had moved to San Francisco in the 1960s and quickly become a high-powered secretary in the city's financial district. After joining the counterculture and spending several years in North Beach reading tarot cards and experimenting with hallucinogens, Wilday attended Christmas Eve Mass at the Order's Chapel in 1968 and within weeks had been recruited by Blyton. The intense, diminutive, dark-haired teacher would be the only woman Blyton ever empowered to ordain priests. She would later marry John McCaffrey and lead the Chicago and Boston apostolates. Master Phillip, as John McCaffrey came to be known in the order, rose quickly in the movement's ranks after his previously cited 1968 conversion experience. Ordained as a priest in September 1969, he became Blyton's right-hand man and close confidant between 1969 and 1972. Master J. Raymond Anderson was a Chicago native who had come to San Francisco after suffering a mental breakdown as a soldier in Vietnam. Following his elevation to mastery in 1971, Anderson took over the Fort Worth apostolate. He would last only a few years as a teacher before unresolved internal conflicts led him to step back from the enormous pressures he felt in that role. After leaving the movement, Anderson married, taught small groups of students in the Santa Rosa Rosa area and became a commercial real estate salesperson. Master Andrew Vincent Rossi had the distinction among his peers of having spent 4 years at a Catholic pre-seminary, the Society of the Divine Savior, in St. Nazianz, Wisconsin, during mid-adolescence. Upon graduation, Rossi decided that he was no longer interested in the priesthood and joined the Navy. His gift for foreign languages landed him in the intelligence section, where he became a Chinese language specialist stationed in Washington, D.C. After his discharge, Rossi returned to his native Michigan and enrolled as an anthropology major at the University in Ann Arbor. During this time, he joined the peace movement and became acquainted with Phillip and Daniel Berrigan. In 1967, one semester prior to graduation, Rossi dropped out of school and moved to San Francisco. There he studied Zen Buddhism, participated in street theater, and ran in North Beach counterculture circles, sometimes with Jenny Wilday. The former seminarian joined the order in 1969 at the age of 28. Like John McCaffrey, Rossi had a professional, erudite demeanor that made him an excellent public spokesperson for the movement. He would head the Boston Apostolate for several years in the early 1970s, and in 1978 became the order's new director general. The next woman ordained as a master teacher was a red-haired Hawaii native named Patricia McLean. Master Jessian, as she came to be called, was admired for her elegant, serene demeanor and dedication to service work. McLean was a missionary in Phoenix before being made head of apostolates in San Francisco and St. Petersburg during the early 1970s. She would in time marry Andrew Rossi and become the order's co-director general. McLean's close friend, Marion Carter, was a native of Portland, Oregon, whose first contact with the order was through Tom Steinfeld at a Reno laundromat in 1970. She was ordained into mastery the following year at the age of 19 and called Master M. Blyton believed that Carter had been given a special healing charism and placed her in private training with him throughout 1971 and 1972. She would in time head the movement's celibate suborder of nuns. The last of the teachers of this period was Master Sarah Tony Brown, who entered the movement in 1971. Brown had grown up in a conservative family in Reno, Nevada, and moved to the Southern Bay Area to work with her husband as a restaurant manager. Like Raymond Anderson, Brown was unable to live with the pressures that accompanied her role as a teacher. Within a year of the June conclave, she had left both her husband and the movement and returned to her hometown of Reno. As these portraits suggest, Blyton was not wholly successful in transmitting his spiritual authority to those chosen as his elite inner circle. His vision of 12 established apostolates throughout the country perpetuating the order's work was, as a consequence, only partially completed at the time of his death in 1974. It is reasonable to infer that in his rush to establish the movement on a nationwide scale in the early 1970s, Blyton was simply unable to prepare adequately the young people of whom he expected so much. As the movement matured, the probationary periods for novices, first vowed members, priests, and teachers would gradually be extended to redress this problem. The order's public image during 1972 continued to be generally positive. In a significant public relations coup, San Francisco Bay Area newspapers and television stations carried interviews with Reverend Gil Esquivel after the Christmas food and toy box project he had organized was robbed the morning before the boxes were to be delivered. By the next day, volunteers from throughout the city had begun delivering an overabundance of donated chickens, turkeys, canned foods, and toys to the 300 poor families that had been promised Christmas relief. The news stories of this event praised the order for its annual Christmas and Thanksgiving charity drives and for its ongoing work with homeless men and women at the Fillmore Aid Station and Raphael House. A highly laudatory article in the Lincoln Journal gave the order a stamp of approval for its non-proselytizing work with junkies, its avoidance of restrictive dogma, and its members' passion for selflessness. The movement's center was described as a spotlessly clean beehive of quiet, well-organized activity, and laughter where order students aspired to a Christ-like life of total surrender to God. The piece concluded with a flourish: "If you're trapped in the valley of the damned or in any of man's other pits of despair, follow the sound of that laughter to the house where miracles still happen." In a final example, a feature in the Charleston, West Virginia Daily Mail highlighted the movement's continuing self-representation as a specific for what ailed modern Christianity. Rather than offering standard religious dogma or a philosophy of religion, the order presented a way of life that combined the approaches of the Christian and Oriental churches with the teachings of science and the New Testament. Two negative articles did appear in 1972, both written by Lester Kinsolving, a religion editor for the San Francisco Examiner. Kinsolving, who was also an Episcopalian priest, had gained a reputation as a probing interviewer and tough critic of new religious movements. Blyton agreed to be interviewed by Kinsolving in his office at 20 Steiner Street, and by all accounts welcomed the reporter in a friendly, open manner. According to one report, Blyton deftly fielded the reporter's questions for the first part of the interview, but began to lose patience when Kinsolving repeatedly asked him about his stand on reincarnation. After Blyton reprimanded the reporter for his failure to fulfill properly his priestly vocation, the tone of the interview turned decidedly hostile. The first article derived from this interview, which appeared on November 24th, began by commenting on the record defections and dwindling recruitment that most monastic orders were experiencing at the time. Blyton's semi-monastic non-denominational order, however, had recruited around 500 committed members in 4 years and established mission stations in 47 states. Kinsolving's tone became more critical when Blyton refused to disclose the secret meaning of the MANS acronym. He stressed Blyton's unquestioned authority within the movement and the considerable poverty and absolute obedience required of students. When asked about the order's finances, Blyton at first demurred, but later referred Kinsolving to the group's accountant. The accountant confirmed that the order's annual income of $1 million was spent on charity work and upkeep. He then concluded, according to the article, neither Blyton nor anyone else is making a private profit. Kinsolving next took aim at the group's training of novices. During the first 90 days, he reported, the recruit was restricted to the brother house, except for outside work as directed. The neophyte was allowed neither visitors nor the right to communicate with anyone outside the order. Kinsolving then criticized the group's obscure theology, as well as its belief in the Great White Brotherhood and reincarnation. He also confronted Blyton and Andrew Rossi, who was present for the interview, with published reports that each had claimed memories of past lives. At this point, the article recounted, Blyton became irritable and sidestepped the question by responding, "Our theology is Pauline." When Kinsolving persisted and asked, "Does the Order of Mans teach reincarnation?" Blyton snapped, "We don't want to be quoted as such. We know reincarnation is possible, but what we want our people to know, we will teach them." Rossi appeared to be more forthcoming when confronted with statements he had made in past newspaper articles. He confirmed that he had memories of previous life experiences in China and Europe, and that the order taught 2 sacraments in addition to the familiar 7, used in most apostolic churches. Kinsolving then asked where Blyton had earned his framed ordination certificate. The director answered, "Certificates mean so little to me. I just don't remember the name of that school that made me a doctor. I think it was a Wesleyan Methodist school in Los Angeles." This comment later proved embarrassing when, in a follow-up article on December 24th, Kinsolving reported that Blyton's 1966 Doctor of Divinity degree had in fact been bestowed by a diploma mill in Florida, Faith Bible College, run by an ex-convict. This follow-up article documented Blyton's convictions in 1946 for practicing medicine without a license, and in 1949 for non-support of his first wife. In addition, it made light of the Director General's claims of reincarnation, printing his laughing picture with the caption, "The Reverend Dr. Earl Wilbur Blyton, self-identified as reincarnation of St. Paul." Perhaps most embarrassingly, the piece lampooned the order's status as an officially licensed school of Bible study and ministerial training, commenting that any corporation affirming at least $50,000 worth of property and a devotion to education could legally issue diplomas and degrees. Because they appeared in San Francisco's major newspaper and publicly questioned Blyton's character, Kinsolving's 2 articles constituted a traumatic episode in the order's history. Although they had no noticeable effect on recruitment, the articles did cause Blyton a degree of personal anguish and made the movement extremely careful about its future interactions with the press. The questioning of Blyton's credentials even elicited a message from the Master Jesus. The message suggested that the earned degrees of order priests be noted on their official records so that the information could be used by corporation officials for public relations purposes. According to a former confidant, Blyton was greatly troubled by the 50% attrition rate the group had sustained during its first 4 years and by the defection of some of his closest students. The consolidation accomplished during 1971 and 1972 can in this sense be interpreted as an attempt by the Director General to strengthen the movement's commitment mechanisms. As defined by sociologist Rosabeth Kanter, these mechanisms are strategies used by intentional communities to create powerful emotional bonds between individual members and the group as a whole. When the mechanisms are operating properly, the community becomes the member's primary set of relations, as well as the basis for his or her subsequent emotional gratification. Kanter has delineated 6 commitment-building processes that use property, work, intimate relationships, leadership, and ideology to generate and sustain member commitment. The first of these is sacrifice. Through sacrifice, a person is asked to give up something as the price of membership. The process operates on the principle that the more it costs a person to do something, the more valuable he or she will consider it. Blyton's tightening of regulations concerning marriage and childbearing, his institution of life vows, and his demands of absolute obedience can, from Kanter's perspective, all be understood as strategies to up the cost of order membership, and thus to increase its value in the eyes of ambivalent members. Kanter's second commitment-building process is investment. In this process, a member makes a significant commitment of energy and resources to the group so that leaving it would be costly. An important aspect of investment is its irreversibility. In Kanter's research, successful communities tended not to reimburse defectors for their labors on behalf of the community or for their contributions of property or capital. This created a situation wherein a person had to continue membership in order to reap his reward. The order's requirement that members give all their earnings to the Brotherhood's common fund was not a compelling commitment mechanism as long as its recruits were penniless dropouts. However, once the group began recruiting from a larger cross-section of socioeconomic groups, and its assets had grown to over $1 million, members found it harder to leave behind what they viewed as a thriving enterprise in which they had a large personal investment. The order also began making it abundantly clear during the early 1970s that defectors could not expect to be reimbursed for their contributions of labor and earnings. The third of Kanter's commitment mechanisms is the renunciation of relationships deemed to be potentially disruptive of group cohesion. These relationships can include those with non-members, with family, and with one's spouse. Protection against relationships with non-members is created by such strategies as geographical isolation, institutional self-sufficiency, distinctive in-group jargon and dress styles, and the strict control of visitors in the community. Protection against exclusive two-person relationships, particularly those of a sexual nature, is considered crucial because they represent competition for members' emotional energy and loyalty. Family withdrawal constitutes an ever greater threat to a group's cohesion than the withdrawal of couples. Successful groups separate children from parents and do not allow families to share private dwelling units. The order developed strategies to deal with each of these potential threats to group commitment. It promoted the peculiar in-group discourse that has already been noted and enforced a strict dress code. These practices, coupled with the increasingly limited access to order centers by non-members that Blyton instituted in the early 1970s, effectively insulated members from meaningful outside relationships. Finally, the Order's new regulations on marriage and childbearing, its development of the children's farm in Sebastopol, and its frequent separation of spouses during student training all helped protect the group against the dangers of exclusive relationships and nuclear families. The fourth commitment mechanism Cantor terms communion. Communion mechanisms develop in members a sense of belonging, equality, fellowship, and group consciousness, which leads to the formation of a cohesive and emotionally satisfying community. Communion is strengthened through regularized group contact in work, worship, meals, and classes. The Order's dense communal living arrangements, increasingly elaborated collective worship, and shared manual labor on its newly purchased houses all helped to strengthen its sense of communion during 1971 and 1972. The fifth commitment mechanism is mortification. Mortification processes break down a member's identification with the separate private ego and foster a new identity based on the power and meaningfulness of group membership. These processes are aided by stratification systems that distinguish members by their degree of moral commitment to the group's goals. Blyton's continual admonitions against disobedience, pride, and egotism during 1971 and 1972 had the effect of strengthening these mortification processes in the Order. The Director General also took every opportunity to promote the meaningfulness and value of group membership. In a 1972 general letter entitled, "Who Am I and Why Am I Here?" for example, he proclaimed to his students that they were true soldiers of Jesus Christ who had come to earth to manifest the reality of the new heaven and the new earth. The letter also reminded members that the Order took excellent care of their physical needs and provided them with good scholastic training in the ancient wisdoms. Moreover, the movement offered women an opportunity to serve Christ through the priesthood for the first time in history. A final heightening of the Order's mortification processes occurred through the group's continued elaboration of privileges and statuses based on degree of commitment and spiritual attainment. The last of Cantor's commitment processes is transcendence. This relates to the posited need of humans to feel that their individual lives are somehow connected to a larger framework of meaning. Successful groups foster this feeling by creating a context wherein members experience great spiritual power through the movement's leaders and ritual practices. They also engender transcendence by connecting their social systems to a transcendent moral order. Blyton was a masterful strategist in each of these areas. His demonstrations of spiritual prowess had already convinced his students that he was a member of the all-powerful White Brotherhood. During 1972, he widened this charismatic mantle to include the master teachers, who soon were regarded by the rank and file as spiritual adepts of the same magnitude as Blyton himself. The Director General then augmented his transcendent status by removing himself more and more from the Order's daily operations during 1972. The revelations of this period claimed this was needed so that Blyton could spend more time in private spiritual labors. The outer effect of this withdrawal, however, was to increase the sense of transcendent awe that members felt toward their leader. Finally, Blyton's claim that the directives in the Book of Activity and the Book of Order had come from the Master Jesus himself heightened the sacred aura surrounding the Brotherhood's lifestyle and gave members a powerful daily experience of communal transcendence. Perhaps the foundational objective of all commitment mechanisms is to reconfigure the member's sense of self so completely that efficacious personal identity becomes inextricably connected with group identity. This process of identity reconfiguration is particularly effective when it offers a greatly enhanced sense of self-significance and self-empowerment. In short, when being a member in good standing allows a person to see him or herself as a heroic figure of transcendent capabilities. The foregoing provides a suggestive framework for interpreting the Order's sophisticated system of ritual initiation. These initiatory rites, with their high ceremonialism, colorful costumes, dramaturgical expressiveness, and charismatic power, helped the group's members radically reconstruct their personal identities. Prior to their conversion, most of these members had existed in a state of thorough alienation from normative society, the result of which was an attenuated sense of self-worth and a profound confusion as to their social role. By donning ceremonial robes and repeatedly entering the sacred time and space of the initiatory rites, this unstable sense of personal identity could be powerfully reconfigured within a mythical and transcendent world of esoteric codes, cosmic forces, angelic beings, and master adepts. At each step of vowed commitment, the initiate was granted higher status and greater authority within this transcendent realm. In the initiations of illumination and self-realization, the member's sense of self became identified with an immortal spiritual essence that transcended even the most exalted hieratic role. Those willing to undergo this powerful transformation of identity were richly rewarded. They found that they now functioned with a greatly enhanced sense of self-significance and self-confidence. In addition, they lived in a community whose members continually reinforced their vision of themselves as immortal soldiers in a cosmic crusade. As would become apparent, however, these rewards were secure only as long as the member remained committed to the Brotherhood community. Outside this community, where his or her status as priest, teacher, or initiate was unrecognized, the specter of alienation and identity confusion again loomed large. By the end of 1972, the Order had refined its organizational structures, strengthened its fledgling centers around the country, expanded its lay outreach programs, and positioned itself to accept a new wave of young recruits. The movement had become a vibrant, wealthy, and tightly organized religious order with an institutional presence in 48 states. It had managed to garner favorable public attention for its social service work and to attract the allegiance of growing numbers of baby boomers disillusioned with the hippie and the radical political subcultures. The national expectations of an imminent consciousness reformation, as articulated in such popular books of the period as Charles Reich's The Greening of America and George Leonard's The Transformation, were higher than ever. According to Reich, the liberation that had begun in the 1960s was freeing each individual to build his own philosophy and values, his own lifestyle, and his own culture for a new beginning. For Leonard, the 1970s were to be the beginning of the most thoroughgoing change in the quality of human existence since the birth of civilized states. Commentators such as Gregory Bateson predicted that the coming decade would be comparable to America's Federalist period in its intensive, open debate of new social and political conceptions, and in its widespread search for more meaningful cultural forms. The Order's millenarian vision and increasingly elaborated communal substructure reflected this hopeful and culturally innovative spirit of the times. However, just over the horizon lay Watergate, the collapse of South Vietnam, the oil embargo, and the world economic recession of 1973 and 1974. In the midst of this time of national pessimism, Earl Blyton would suddenly die. It is to the final years of Blyton's life and the tumultuous period following his death that we now turn. Chapter 4. A Crisis of Confidence, the Final Years of Father Paul, and the Aftermath of his Death, 1973 to 1978. The Holy Order of Mans continued to grow at a steady pace during 1973 and early 1974, reporting 619 vowed members at its 1974 annual meeting. By March 1974, the movement operated 64 centers throughout the United States, 35 of which were owned by the Order Corporation. New stations had been established in Milwaukee, Fargo, Dallas, Omaha, Memphis, Montgomery, Miami, Peoria, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Syracuse, and Washington, D.C. Mission teams had also been sent to Munich, West Germany, and Toronto, Canada. Lay Christian communities had received their charters in Denver, San Francisco, Boston, Wichita, Lincoln, and Indianapolis, and the Order of Discipleship counted 434 active members. 9 movement-published books on esoteric Christianity were now being sold through the discipleship program and through a national book distributor in San Francisco. The order's national visibility also increased during this period during favorable press coverage by Newsweek, the New York Times, and United Press International. As this national expansion progressed, a change began to occur in the type of recruit the Brotherhood was attracting. Though still overwhelmingly middle-class Caucasian Americans had had some exposure to the counterculture lifestyle, these new members were college-educated, employed, and favorably disposed toward the increasingly Christian accent of the movement. With a steady stream of these more sophisticated recruits signing in, the movement tightened its screening procedures and became less willing to accept individuals with a recent history of chemical dependency or mental instability. In towns where large brother houses or Christian communities were located, groups of friends sometimes joined en masse after attending classes and services for several years. In like manner, members of the lay order of discipleship, who were living in remote areas, often entered the Brotherhood after completing the Tree of Life correspondence course. The religious backgrounds of these recruits remained fairly stable, with about 50% coming from Roman Catholic, 35% from Protestant, and 15% from Jewish households. 2 personal stories exemplify the changing profile of the movement's recruits between 1972 and 1974. Al Igarta was a native Hawaiian of mixed Hawaiian, Filipino, Chinese, Spanish, and Native American ancestry. As a youth, he had been exposed to traditional Hawaiian religion through a kahuna uncle and attended Roman Catholic, Pentecostal, and Buddhist churches. Igarta moved to San Francisco in the late 1960s to attend Golden Gate University, from which he graduated with a degree in business accounting. Although he dabbled in the hippie counterculture on weekends, Igarta worked in a conservative business environment, drove a new sports car, and kept his hair short. In the early 1970s, he tired of the social climbing and conspicuous consumption that constituted the young professional's lifestyle, and decided to aim his leisure activities in a more altruistic direction. He became a volunteer tutor in the lower Fillmore ghetto and began to explore such spiritual movements as transcendental meditation and Silva mind control. During lunch with a friend one day, the 26-year-old accountant was introduced to a brother from the Holy Order of Mans. The brother soon invited him to evening classes at 20 Steiner Street. Although Igarta was at first put off by the movement's seemingly conventional religious persona, he became intrigued when told that the group practiced meditation and accepted reincarnation. He began attending classes on a regular basis, and after several months was accepted for membership by the Esoteric Council. Blyton warned Igarta that the order's daily regimen would be a difficult challenge for someone accustomed to a professional's lifestyle, and advised him to keep his job and car until he had decided to take life vows. Igarta moved into the brother house and, much to the consternation of his roommates, brought his 6 suits, 10 dress shirts, and 3 pairs of shoes, all of which were necessary for his job. Shortly after taking first vows, Igarta was put to work in the treasurer's office, where he spent the next few years reorganizing and streamlining the movement's accounting procedures. During his order career, Igarta would serve as the corporation's treasurer and head of the Northwest Apostolate. He left the movement in 1981 and now works as a corporate accountant in Seattle. David Lowell, a second example, was born in upstate New York and received his formative religious training in the Free Methodist tradition. Between 1967 and 1971, Lowell majored in religion and philosophy at Birmingham Southern, a Methodist university in Alabama. He remembered most of his classmates as being long-haired social activists and progressive pot-smoking philosophers. Lowell immersed himself in the study of mysticism, occultism, and Zen Buddhism, and became interested in the writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer while petitioning his local draft board for conscientious objector status. Although he had been accepted to the Master of Divinity program at Drew University, Lowell decided to take a break from his formal education and seek temporary employment after graduation. Within a year, he had adopted a Spartan drug-free lifestyle and made an internal rededication of his life to Christ. Through one of his jobs, Lowell became friends with a member of the Order's Birmingham Center. He attended several classes in early 1973 and became increasingly interested in the group's unusual mixture of Christianity and esotericism. As he recalled later, they were very staunchly Christian, and yet they were very clearly metaphysical and believed in reincarnation, but in a sober, unflashy way, a seemingly integrated way. Lowell saved up enough money to take the train to San Francisco and arrived at 20 Steiner Street with $35 in his hand. He informed the priest who greeted him that he wanted to join and was told, "Fine, come in." It was really about the tail end of the time when you could still do that, Lowell recounted. The 24-year-old novice would go on to become a priest and leader of the Southeast Apostolate in Atlanta. In the late 1980s, he returned to San Francisco and took over the executive directorship of Raphael House, the movement's large emergency shelter. The most significant addition to the Order's teachings during this period was a new emphasis on the figure of Mary, the mother of Jesus. This development can best be interpreted as part of the group's ongoing attempt to redefine the role of women in the New Age. As mentioned in Chapter 1, Blyton considered an important part of his mission to be the raising of women to their rightful spiritual position, something he believed had been neglected by most churches. Blyton also wanted to correct what he considered to be an erroneous interpretation of Paul's epistles that justified relegating women to subordinate roles in church life. He explained to his followers that the epistles had to be read in their proper cultural and historical context and should not be used as a rationale for denying women the spiritual equality that was their birthright. Blyton followed through on his beliefs by ordaining 52 women priests during his tenure as Director General, 6 of whom became master teachers. In addition, women served on the boards of directors of regional apostolates and were elected presidents of these boards on several occasions. In spite of his support for women's equality, however, Blyton appeared to harbor certain gender attitudes that reflected the culture in which he was reared. In sermons, for instance, he consistently condemned jealousy as the quintessential female sin. In addition, the Director General insisted that women clothe themselves in long skirts or dresses, and that those with long hair wear it bound up in public. A former confidant of Blyton remembered that his teacher spoke often of womankind's need to take on the masculine aspect if they were to be successful in their spiritual labors. In this confidant's view, the director's privileging of masculine traits resulted in a concomitant devaluing of feminine traits within the movement. Femaleness represented to him, Blyton, all that was indefinite, petty, emotional, undirected, uncertain, and murky. If women could be trained out of these qualities, they could take part in spiritual work. For him, only the goal of consciousness in the inner world coupled with the ability to function mattered. Blyton reportedly chose as leaders strong, ambitious women who had the courage to take chances. Some respondents, however, interpreted Blyton's attitudes towards women in a different light. For one woman student, Blyton's strong condemnation of female jealousy was his method of burning this pattern out of particular students' subconscious minds. Seen in this way, the director's seeming use of feminine stereotypes was in reality a subtle strategy for helping women to become conscious of and thus to break free from such stereotypes. The dress and grooming codes, in this respondent's view, were designed to help women avoid the distractions of adornment so that they might remain focused on initiatory attainment. A 1971 HOOM letter from an anonymous sister gives an indication of the attempts at gender redefinition that order women were making for themselves during this period. The letter, entitled Spiritual Liberation, began by acknowledging the struggle of contemporary women to understand their proper role in society and in relation to God. The world had so much distorted this role that women often did not know whether they were independent beings or tools for men. Part of this distortion, the letter continued, had come about through a socialization process that had pressured women to judge their worth by the degree to which their physical bodies were admired by men. As a result, women had become chronically dependent on male approval and attention and had lost the awareness that they were first and foremost beings of God. This outer dependency had led women to believe they should always be receiving and never giving. This attitude, in turn, had stopped the flow of God's power and upset the pattern of women's true function. It had also led to a disruption of the natural sisterhood between women because of the possessiveness, malicious gossip, and envy. The solution to this living death in the hell of her own creation, according to the letter, would be found in a new awareness of God the Creator as both male and female, positive and negative. Moreover, by experiencing the mystical unity of male and female forces within themselves, women could transcend their sense of separateness from one another and find a higher oneness in the mind of Christ. The women's liberation movement was a positive development in this regard, in the author's opinion, since it brought women together in a cause greater than themselves and helped them see themselves as sisters. However, this movement was still working from the outside inward. Order sisters worked from the inside outward, seeking first the unity of Christ within themselves. This labor at the level of interior awareness allowed them to let go of the subtle mass mind female patterns buried deep within their psyches. Once this was accomplished, the letter concluded, women became powerful beings who received the gift of the Spirit from within in order to share it with humanity. The last paragraph of this letter mentioned the Blessed Mother as the key to a woman's understanding of her higher nature. Both Ruth and Earl Blyton, in their sermons, classes, and general letters of this period, elaborated on this theme. At the sister house on 910 Steiner Street, where the couple now lived, they began teaching special classes on Mary to the novices and first vowed students. In sermons, Blyton advised his students to read biographies of Mary so that they might comprehend the full measure of a life of service. Messages received in 1972 and 1973 admonished members to hold sacred the Blessed Mother's work with the sisters and brothers in this world and to pattern themselves after her sacrificial love. Those who did so, the messages added, would have great success in working with women. In messages sent out in the last months of 1972, Blyton began to articulate his Mariology in greater detail. The Blessed Mother Mary, the messages began, from the time of her incarnation as the Mother of Jesus, had become the guardian of mothers, sisters, and children, and the means of intercession with Christ. Knowing that her Son had risen to such heights that humankind would no longer be able to touch readily the consciousness of his great and loving heart. Mary, with God's aid, had ascended to a vibratory level just above the earth plane. From this level, she could draw true seekers into an experience of Christ's atonement. Blyton exhorted order members who had not experienced this atonement to open their hearts to Mary and to accept her help in reaching her Son. He also declared that from henceforth the Holy Order of Mans would fight to champion the Blessed Virgin Mary. This would entail speaking to others of her reality and prayerfully beseeching her Sacred Heart to bring others to Christ. Through her burning passion for selfless service, Blyton continued, Mary was bringing womankind into the fullness of her spiritual reality. Apart from its roots in Blyton's personal exposure to Catholicism, this vision of Mary was derived from a book in his private library entitled The Blessed Virgin, Her Life and Mission. The book's author, Corinne Helene, had been an associate of Max Heindel, the founder of the California-based Rosicrucian Fellowship. Her many books on Christian esotericism announced a dawning age of spiritual illumination during which the divine feminine, of whom Mary was the perfect embodiment, would prepare humanity for Christ's return. According to Helene, Mary had continued to work with earthbound humanity after her bodily assumption into heaven, a Catholic doctrine, and had become a bridge of light between earth and heaven. Belonging to no particular church or creed, the Divine Mary now worked for the regeneration of the human race and the full spiritual emancipation of womankind. Her appearances during the 20th century, a reference to the reported apparitions of Mary at such places as Fatima, Portugal, and Borang, Belgium, Helene concluded demonstrated her abiding interest in humanity. Blyton wrote several pastoral letters during 1973 and 1974 that further elaborated his Mariology. In a missive entitled Mary, the Model of Christian Womanhood, Blyton asserted that Mary had paid the price of the Garden of Eden's error by giving birth to Jesus. This payment had made possible woman's kind present spiritual This payment had made possible womankind's present spiritual elevation, of which the Brotherhood's ordination of women was one example. By March 1974, Blyton had raised the figure of Mary to a position co-equal with Christ himself. The mantles of each of these great initiates, he proclaimed, now enveloped the earth with divine consciousness, transforming the power of God to a reduced voltage more accessible to humanity. Both figures were also showering protection and healing upon order missionaries as they strove to carry out their initiatory labors. Blyton's final teaching concerning Mary and women appeared in a general letter dated April 8, 1974. In it, he expressed indignation at the Catholic Church's proclamation of Mary as a liberated woman in a November 1973 pastoral letter. In the director's view, the Blessed Virgin stood above all such worldly discourse. She was free because she had been totally obedient to the Spirit. In a similar manner, women priests in the order were liberated only insofar as they were dedicated to bringing the light of Christ to humanity. Blyton disparaged the idea of a new woman, contending that a woman's true liberation came from an awareness of her innate divine authority. The key to woman's happiness, Blyton concluded, was that they imitate Mary's example of putting God's work first and personal desires second. In the view of one respondent, Blyton's Mariology placed Mary on a pedestal high up, out of the reach of humanity. She was the disembodied feminine hero who had sacrificed all that was personal and individual for the sake of Christ's salvific work. In this sense, the respondent concluded, Blyton's conception devalued the earthly roles that traditionally had been ascribed to women, such as mother, home manager, and maintainer of personal relationships. Other interviewees, however, argued that Blyton emphasized only those virtues of Mary that he believed were most necessary for the order's success. Seen from this perspective, the director's failure to discuss Mary's more mundane roles was a direct result of his desire to keep families and children out of his spiritual army. The order's new emphasis on the divine feminine became apparent in several dimensions of the group's activities. The HOOM, for example, published a series of articles on Marian themes throughout this period. These included features on the Rosary, the brown scapular, and Marian apparitions of the 20th century. Letters from the Field, in a second instance, described the Mary shrines that missionaries were now setting up in their chapels. These shrines typically consisted of a small table upon which a red eternal flame burned. Hanging on the wall above the shrine was often a classical depiction of the Madonna. One missionary reported that she placed her Mary shrine between two wooden columns in imitation of the Tarot's High Priestess image. In a third example, nearly 40 brothers and sisters walked in a Catholic-sponsored processional through San Francisco in late 1973 to celebrate Our Lady of the Holy Rosary. The movement also began to direct more of its attention to health issues, some of which focused on the figure of Mary as a channel of healing. Over 43 articles on this theme appeared in the HOOM during 1973. The topics ranged from vitamin therapy to proper tooth care. In a 1973 directive from the Esoteric Council, priests were admonished to pay more attention to the physical health of their students. When members became seriously ill, their name was to be placed on a prayer list that would be kept in a center's chapel. At the same time, a trained physician was to be notified, since many priests had not yet become competent at spiritual healing. A special healing mass of the Blessed Mother was received from Blyton's non-corporeal guides at the end of 1972. This rite was elaborated in the months that followed and became known as the Healing Invocation of Mary. The invocation, which usually occurred during a full moon, began with a prayer that the Blessed Mother might lift those present into the shadow of the Lord Jesus Christ. The person to be healed, who was kneeling within the sanctuary's law triangle, then proclaimed his or her acceptance of Mary as a channel of healing. The presiding priest next placed hands over what was thought to be the member's heart chakra and asked, "Would thou permit me to open thine heart to this glorious being, the Blessed Virgin Mother, so thou canst receive the pure essence of her compassion?" The student answered affirmatively and promised to hold 7-hour-long vigils at the Mary Shrine over the next week in gratitude for the mother's healing gifts. After this, the presiding priest and 3 other celebrants encircled the member and called down the divine healing force from heaven. They then locked their right hands together above the center of the student's head and invoked the fire of Michael and the spirit of Raphael, the archangels of healing. After more prayers and a laying on of hands, the member was raised to a standing position and bade to go in good health and in the light of Christ. At the organizational level, the new Marian focus led to the formation of 2 suborders, the Immaculate Heart Sisters of Mary, IHSM, and the Brown Brothers of the Holy Light, BBHL. The impetus of the IHSM came in a revelation received by Blyton on Christmas Day, 1972, purportedly from Mary herself. The message described the suborder as a new stage of training for sisters who had finished the first and second level Tree of Life lessons. A sister who entered this training would dedicate herself to prayer and service work in hospitals, schools, and clinics. She would also take a 1-year vow of celibacy and live together with other IHSM sisters. When the year was completed, the sister could choose to remain in the suborder indefinitely or return to the vowed brotherhood where she might marry. The message indicated that both Mother Ruth and Master M, Marian Carter, would direct the training of the sisters, and that Carter would act as the suborder's sister superior. This 21-year-old master teacher would also be required to take a lifelong vow of celibacy in order to set the highest possible standard of conduct for the sisterhood. The IHSMs, the message concluded, would in time become the foundation upon which the holiness of the order rested. Blyton elaborated upon the Christmas directive in January 1973, HOOM. The suborder's sisters, he wrote, would staff new mission stations, aid patients in psychiatric and medical clinics, and work with retarded children, the deaf, and the blind. Through their service, work students would develop a selfless attitude and be prepared to fulfill their sacred calling as women. The director also hoped the suborder would answer the delusions of the mass mind that had at times called into question the Brotherhood's coeducational format. The idea for the Brown Brothers of the Holy Light came through divine revelation on August 24, 1972. The original conception was to form a cadre of missionary brothers who would work with lay families interested in forming a Christian community. After training a core group of these families, the Brown Brothers would leave and a priest would be sent to pastor the newly chartered community. This elite of the elite would also seek out the order's lost sheep and bring them back to fulfill their vows. 3 brothers came to San Francisco in late 1972 to begin training in the new suborder. For a period of 4 weeks, the trainees worked 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, under the direction of Joseph Brown, the Brown brothers' first abbot. The suborder's first graduate, Raymond Berry, moved into the home of a San Francisco family who were attempting to organize a Christian community. Within 8 weeks, the team had rented a storefront, set up a chapel, and arranged a weekly series of classes. A short time later, Berry moved on to another assignment, while a priest was installed as pastor of the newly chartered Golden Dawn Christian Community of San Francisco. By the beginning of 1973, Brown and 3 students had established the Brown Brothers Abbey at the Order's Wichita Center. Within 6 months, 19 trainees had already been sent out to work as stewards, cooks, and Christian community leaders. Further guidance as to the BBHL's mission was received in a revelation on July 14, 1973. The Brown Brothers were to offer their service and prayers as a unified petition for the errors and sins of man. Although the Master Jesus had paid off the debts of humankind incurred until the time of his coming, his sacrifice had not automatically covered subsequent sins. For forgiveness of these, the message maintained, persons must turn with a contrite heart to Christ, who would then grant absolution. Given this state of affairs, the BBHL would dedicate its prayers to those who had not yet taken advantage of Christ's healing forgiveness. The heads of both suborders were officially installed in an elaborate ceremony in San Francisco on July 29, 1973. The last new moon in July, Carter was given $300 and told to find a job in Oakland, where the first IHSM convent would be established. Notably, she was given a specific set of instructions that the older Brown, he was 37 at the time, never received. The instructions directed that she come periodically to San Francisco for private counseling with the Blytons, and that she not speak to anyone else in the Brotherhood. In addition, Carter was to have no male companionship at her house and to keep its location a secret. She was to train 7 women in the teachings of the order and then bring them for council approval and examination. If the trainees were found acceptable, they would be administered vows in the IHSM and the suborder would officially begin its work. It is likely that these special restrictions represented a kind of probationary period for Carter, who had given birth out of wedlock to a son named Nathaniel in 1972. According to insiders of this period, Blyton had commanded Carter to place her son at the group's Sebastopol farm. The young teacher had balked, however, and made it clear that she intended to be a mother. For Blyton, this resistance constituted an outright rebellion that interfered with the order's greater mission. He placed Carter under guard and made sure a brother accompanied her whenever she went out of the house. Whether this account is accurate or not, the secrecy surrounding Carter's seclusion in Oakland and the requirement of a lifetime vow of celibacy are suggestive that she was undergoing disciplinary measures related to sexual indiscretions. It is also of interest that Blyton's wife was adamantly opposed to the lifetime celibacy vow, feeling that such a vow was too great a burden to place on the young woman. Although Blyton was greatly upset at this opposition, he finally relented and revised Carter's vow of celibacy to 5 years. The growth of the suborders was rapid and successful. By February 1974, 32 Brown brothers had been enrolled in the Wichita Abbey, a number that would rise to 54 by September. The IHSM converted the Brother House in Berto Avenue in Chicago into its Mary House and moved there in late 1973. By September 1974, the suborder had enrolled 35 sisters, most of whom were at mission stations around the country. Students who joined the BBHL during its first year remembered the strenuous physical work, fervent Marian devotions, and tireless service that constituted their training. This missionary preparation lasted for 6 weeks and included 4 periods of daily devotions, street patrols, and intensive classes in counseling, purchasing, business management, first aid, and emergency childbirth. The students were also authorized to administer baptisms, missionary communion, and last rites. Each member wore a brown monk's robe that had the suborder's insignia and motto sewn over the left chest area. The insignia consisted of a royal blue escutcheon over which were embroidered 2 crossed white swords. In the center of the insignia was a red rose that was surrounded by the letters BBHL. Under the escutcheon was the suborder's motto, Lux est cum eos, the light is with us. Joseph Brown, the BBHL's abbot, soon became a legendary figure in the Brotherhood. The black-bearded, portly teacher had at one time worked as a stand-up comedian and used long, humorous stories as his main teaching tool. One of the most entertaining of these tales was that of Brown's own conversion to the order. The story began with the abbot lying in bed one evening, imploring God's guidance as to the path he should follow in life. Suddenly a door appeared on the wall next to his bed. The door opened, and a short, white-haired man walked through it. The old man lit a match, held it out in front of him, and peered at Brown intently. He then re-entered the imaginary doorway and disappeared. Several weeks later, Brown, who managed a restaurant at the time, was invited by one of his workers, an order sister, to meet Blyton. The manager accepted the invitation and came to call one evening at 20 Steiner Street. He spent his first hour in a basement chapel watching a film on the life of Ignatius Loyola with the assembled community. The film's seeming endorsement of self-mortification practices left him unimpressed and on the verge of leaving. When the movie was over, Blyton invited Brown into his office, where, between frequent glances at an episode of Kojak playing on his small television, the older man engaged Brown in friendly banter. Brown, who had expected someone a little more spiritual, was counting the seconds before he could make his excuses and get away. Just as he was preparing to go, Blyton struck a match to light his pipe, thrust it before Brown's face, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Remember this?" Deeply shaken, the future abbot implored Blyton to accept him as a student, and was received into the movement a short time later. Those who worked personally with Brown during their time in the suborder spoke of him as an insightful and dynamic spiritual guide. Following their training in Wichita, students were assigned an area of the country, given $75, put on a Greyhound bus, and told, "We'll see you in a year." As one former missionary recounted, it was all on your own resources. We weren't even expected to work for a living. We were expected to be on the streets and to trust God to take care of all our needs. It was directly out of the Bible, take neither scrip nor purse, so that's what we did. The $75 was just kind of stake money, emergency money. The first of us went out alone in these areas. Later, we were sent out in pairs, but it was essentially the same thing. While on assignment in a particular region, the brothers studied fourth-level Tree of Life lessons, taught public classes, and conducted street missions. The experience of walking around an American city in a brown robe was not without its challenges. As one ex-brother commented, you might end up in Ogden, Utah, walking around one of the Mormon capitals of the world in a long Catholic-looking brown robe. You were prey to all kinds of ideas and judgments. Nevertheless, the strong sense of mission that the suborder inculcated in its members made it possible for most of them to complete their year in the field and return to the order's main body, strengthened by the experience.